Okay, today we are going to talk about the basic chemistry of cells, Chapter 2. Keep in mind we are not going to go into deep chemistry. We're just going to cover basic chemistry because you have to understand basic chemistry in order to understand biology, because after all, we are chemical beings. So we're going to start out by talking about the atoms of cells and what makes up elements, and then we're going to talk about how they form molecules and the types of chemical bonds. Then we're going to talk about the properties of water, because our bodies are mostly water. And we're going to end with talking about acids, bases, and pH. So, chemistry is the science that studies the composition of matter. And matter is anything that takes up space and has weight or mass. Now, weight and mass are a little different because weight takes gravity into account and mass does not. Astronauts, for example, in space are weightless because they do not have gravity, but they still have mass. So we're also going to talk about atoms and molecules and eventually get up to cells in the next chapter. So atoms and molecules, remember, are non-living. Cells is where life starts. Life begins with the cell. So atoms will combine to form molecules, and molecules will then combine to form cells. And cells start life. So, both living and non-living things have a chemical basis, so living and non-living things do have that in common. 3 forms of matter exist: solid, liquid, and gas. Solids have a definitive shape and a definitive volume. Liquids have a definitive volume, but have the shape of the container that they're in. So if you take a cup of water, for example, and you pour it onto a table, that's still a cup of water, now it's just spilled all over a table. And gas is kind of tricky because gas does not have a definitive volume or a definitive shape, because as you release gas, it dissipates. So an element is what all matter is made of. It is the smallest thing that you can't break it down any further unless you use high-tech methods. So there are 92 naturally occurring elements. The rest are man-made, man-made. Some of the elements have actually been made in a lab and have only existed for seconds, but it's still an element because they created it. 6 of the elements make up 95% of an organism's body weight, and they are schnapps. C is for carbon, H is for hydrogen, N is for nitrogen, O is for oxygen, P is for phosphorus, and S is for sulfur. So these 6 elements make up 95% of our body weight. There are the naturally occurring elements in the human body. You can see the 6 that we're going to focus on surrounded in red. If you go on to an anatomy class, calcium, potassium, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium all become important. But for our purposes, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur are the big ones. Most matter is made up of more than one element, so keep that in mind. The elements are going to interact. Here's a periodic table of the table of the elements, sorry. If you look at it, you can see the atomic symbol, which is the letters that you see. It's an abbreviation for the particular element. If you look up top, there's a number, and that's called the atomic number. That is the number of protons that an element has, and we'll cover those in a second. If you look on the bottom of each box, there's also another number. That is the atomic weight or atomic mass. They're pretty similar, which is the protons and the neutrons added together. And we'll go over this again, don't worry. The column all the way to the right in like a bluish purple kind of hue, those are the noble gases. Now the noble gases are special because the noble gases are inert, which means that they're non-reactive. They do not react with any other elements. Their outer shell is full, so they do not have any room to interact. So helium, neon, argon, krypton, xenon, radon, those are all noble gases. So an atom is the smallest unit of an element. Atoms of an element are going to have similar chemical and physical properties. Properties of carbon are going to be different than oxygen, though. So each element is different, but the atoms of the same element are going to be the same. So atoms are made up of 3 subatomic particles: protons, neutrons, and electrons. Protons have a positive charge, so remember PP, proton positive. Neutrons have a neutral charge, so neutral. And electrons have a negative charge. And I don't have anything for that one, so if you can remember protons are positive and neutrons are neutral, then you can just remember electrons are negative. The protons and the neutrons are in the nucleus, and the electrons orbit around the nucleus in what are called orbitals or shells. So all matter is composed of atoms. So here's an overview again. Protons, positive charge in the nucleus. Neutrons, no charge in the nucleus. Electrons, negative charge in the electron shells. Now, if you look at the first number in that chart, atomic mass, that's the mass of a proton, a neutron, and an electron. So the proton mass is about 1 atomic mass unit. A neutron mass is about 1 atomic mass unit. And an electron is negligible. So we do not pay attention to atomic mass of an electron here. If you take a chemistry class, now you might have to worry about electrons, but we don't worry about them in our class. But protons and neutrons give the atoms weight or mass, and that's what's important here. So again, if you look at the diagram there, each proton in the nucleus has a positive charge and a mass of 1. Each neutron in the nucleus has no charge and a mass of 1. And each electron is small enough that we don't really care, but has a negative charge. All atoms of the same element are going to have the same number of protons. So all carbon atoms, for example, are going to have 6 protons. And we'll look at that more in depth in a minute. So the electron shells, or the energy levels, contain orbitals. And each orbital can hold up to 2 electrons, but can be more, as you can see. So the first electron shell has 1 orbital. So it holds a maximum of 2 electrons. The second electron shell has 4 orbitals. So it holds a maximum of 8 electrons. And the third electron shell has 9 orbitals. So that holds a maximum of 18 electrons. But we do not really care about orbitals in here. We care about the shells. So the orbitals, if you take a chemistry class, you're probably going to have to know all of those, but we don't care. What we care about is the first shell having 2, the second shell having 8, and the third shell having 8. Because the second and third energy levels are full when they have 8 electrons. It's called the octet rule. That first electron shell is full when it has 2. So the outermost shell is called the valence shell. And that's what's actually going to determine the reactivity of the element. Because depending on how many electrons are in that outer shell, that's going to determine how many other elements the particular one reacts with. So if you look at that first picture, that's showing you the first shell is full with 2 electrons. And then the second picture is showing you the first and the second electron shells are full. So you've got 2 in the first one, 8 in the second shell. And the last picture is showing you all 3 levels full, with the first one having 2 and the second and third having 8. Now keep in mind that third one can hold up to 18, but for our purposes it's full when it has 8. We follow the octet rule. So make sure that you can draw and recognize the atomic structures of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. The atomic number, the number at the top, tells you how many protons there are. The atomic symbol represents the name of the element, and the atomic mass tells you how many protons and neutrons there are, because it's equal to the atomic weight, basically. So you add up the protons and neutrons, and that gives you the atomic mass. So, number of protons in the nucleus is the atomic number. The number of neutrons in the nucleus is the atomic mass minus the atomic number. The number of electrons is equal to the number of protons. Atoms in the periodic table are all neutral, which means they do not have a charge. So the number of protons has to equal the number of electrons. So up top there, if you look at carbon, carbon is C is the atomic symbol. 6 is the atomic number, so that tells you carbon has 6 protons. Because it's neutral, that tells you it also has 6 electrons. And then the atomic mass is 12, so 12 minus 6 is 6. So carbon has 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. 666. Not. So as I just said, 666. Now you're going to have a picture like this on your test, and you're going to have to say how many protons, neutrons, and electrons carbon has. So make sure that you know how to interpret this. And they're not always going to be the same. Most of the ones that we work with will be the same, but they won't always be the same, just so you know. So there's a picture showing you the 6 protons and neutrons in the nucleus. And then the first orbital shell is filled with 2, and the second one only has 4, so a total of 6 electrons. Now, since the outer shell has 4 electrons in it, how many do we want it to have? Hopefully you said 8. So that means that carbon combined with 4 other elements. And that's very important. When you look at the periodic table, the row tells you how many shells surround the nucleus. So helium and hydrogen up there are in the first row, so they only have 1 shell. So they're full with 2 electrons. The second row have 2 shells, the third row 3, and so on. The column number tells you how many electrons are in the outer shell. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 being the noble gases, so that's why they do not react with anything else. Their outer shell is full. So there's your carbon again. So carbon is in the second row, has 2 shells. It is in column 4, so it has 4 electrons in the outer shell. So try these real quick. Hydrogen, how many protons, electrons, and neutrons? Hopefully you said 1 proton, 1 electron. Now this can be a little tricky. The atomic mass is 1, and there's 1 proton. So 1 minus 1 is 0. So that tells you there are no neutrons in hydrogen. Try nitrogen for a second. Hopefully you said 7, 7, and 7. And there's the structure of hydrogen or nitrogen. Try oxygen real quick. Hopefully you said 8, 8, and 8. And there's the structure of oxygen. Now oxygen has 6 electrons in its outermost shell. Hydrogen has 1. So hydrogen are always going to be twice the amount of whatever element it binds to, because hydrogen can only make 1 bond. So water, for example, H2O. There are 2 hydrogens that bind to 1 oxygen. Oxygen has room for 2, hydrogen has room for 1, so 1 goes on each side of the oxygen molecule. And as I said, protons, neutrons, and electrons, the numbers are not always the same. So electrons are associated with energy. Electrons in the outer shell have the most potential energy. Electrons in the inner shell have the least potential energy. That's because opposites attract. So the negatively charged electrons are attracted to the positively charged protons in the nucleus. So it takes energy to push them out. So imagine if you're trying to push someone away. It's easier to push somebody right here than it is to push somebody all the way back there. It's the same thing for the electrons. So the ones in the outermost shell have more energy because there's not as strong of a hold on those. So they can mingle easier. So you have to keep track of the number of electrons in the outermost shell. That's very important. Those are what are used to determine the reactivity with another atom. If you don't have a complete shell on the outside, it'll react with another atom until their shell is complete. So which of these two is reactive, A or B? So you just count the number of electrons in the outermost shell for both of them. A has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. B has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8, remember, it's full, so A is going to be the reactive atom. So atoms can give up, accept, or share electrons to complete their outer shell. So which of these atoms is most likely to give up an electron? Hopefully you said A, because A only has one little electron in its outer shell. So if A gives up that electron, that shell just disappears. Which atom will most likely accept an electron? Hopefully you said B, because B actually has 7 electrons in its outermost shell. So one more and it's complete. So that's actually sodium and chloride. So sodium gives up an electron to chlorine, which accepts the electron. It's a complete transfer. So sodium becomes more positive, or Na+, because it gave up a negative charge. Chlorine, on the other hand, becomes more negative, or Cl-, because it accepted a negative charge. When you're trying to figure out charges, remember that electrons have a negative charge. So if you add more negativity versus you're giving up negativity. And that's going to become important when we talk about redox reactions later on down the road. So A and B. Which elements have atoms that are inert or non-reactive if you're looking at the periodic table over there? Hopefully you said the noble gases, helium, neon, argon, krypton, xenon, and radon. Why are they inert? Hopefully you said because they have a completed outer shell. So, atoms are neutrally charged. That means the number of protons equals the numbers of electrons. So all of the atoms in the periodic table are neutral. So their protons equal their electrons. Ions are charged atoms. So the number of protons does not equal the number of electrons. So again, if it's giving up an electron, it's becoming more positive. If it's gaining an electron, it's becoming more negative. So as I said, sodium loses an electron, so the whole outer shell just disappears. Isotopes are important. Isotopes are atoms of the same element, so they have the same number of protons, but have a different number of neutrons. Therefore, they have different atomic masses. Carbon is an example that we're going to go through in a minute. So here's carbon, 12, 13, and 14. They all have 6 protons. They all have 6 electrons. But carbon 12 has 6 neutrons, carbon 13 has 7 neutrons, and carbon 14 has 8 neutrons. So that adds to their atomic mass. That's very important because that atomic mass addition makes carbon 14 radioactive. Now you're going to be asked a question on your test. You're going to be asked what's different between isotopes, basically. You have to say the number of neutrons. You cannot say the number of protons, and inevitably it always happens. Some of my students say the number of protons. But if you change the number of protons, you've changed the element. If you add a proton to carbon, you've got nitrogen. If you add a neutron to carbon, you've got carbon 13. So remember, elements have the same number of protons. So you change the number of neutrons, and you change to an isotope. Okay? So as I said, C12, C13, C14. Radioactive isotopes are unstable, but they can be useful. They can be used as tracers for like PET scans and MRIs. They can treat cancer. So at low levels, they can be used in research. They can be used in nuclear medicine or lab tests as tracers. We can look at the thyroid, for example. We can do a PET scan and MRI. At high levels, they can sterilize medical equipment. They can treat cancer, or they can even neutralize anthrax spores. But that's damaging radiation you're talking about. They can also be used to age artifacts. Carbon-14 dating is when they use carbon to date fossils or rocks or anything else that they find. There's a little 2-minute video of carbon dating that you can watch, and at the bottom there's a little 2-minute video talking about atomic structure. So feel free to watch those, but to click on the links, be in slideshow mode and click on those links. Okay, moving on to bonding. A molecule is 2 or more atoms that chemically react together. A compound is 2 or more different elements that chemically react together. So the one exception really is water. Water is technically a compound, but it's often referred to as a molecule. So not all molecules are compounds, but all compounds can be referred to as molecules. And water is probably the biggest exception to that rule. Water is a compound officially, but we always say water molecule. So, what do the following symbols represent? Do we have an atom of an element, a compound, or a molecule? So, C. That's an atom. O2. That's a molecule. H2O. That's a compound, but a molecule. H. That's an atom. CH4. That's a compound. NaCl. That's a compound. So basically, molecules are the same element for the most part. Compounds are different elements for the most part. But like I said, there are many exceptions. Okay, first type of bonding we're going to talk about is ionic bonding. Ionic bonding happens when a complete transfer of electrons occurs. So one element gives another element an electron. So in the sodium and chlorine example that we talked about, sodium donates that electron in its outer shell to chlorine. So sodium is the electron donor, chlorine is the electron acceptor. Sodium becomes Na+, chlorine becomes Cl-. So now they're both electrically charged. They're both stable because their outermost shell is full. So positive ions are cations, negative ions are anions. I was taught cats are positive. So if you want to remember, cats are positive, cations are positive, anions are negative. But there's a natural attraction here for the positive and negative charges to form that ionic bond. But it's a complete transfer of the electron. And just to give you an idea how much that transfer actually changes something, sodium in its natural state is a metal. Chlorine in its natural state is a noxious green gas. You put them together and you have table salt. Covalent bonds happen when 2 atoms share electrons. So they'll share enough electrons so that each has a completed outer shell. They're stronger as opposed to ionic bonds, and there's a lot more energy that is required to break them. The sharing of covalent bonds, sharing of the electrons, though, is not always equal. We have polar and nonpolar bonds. Nonpolar is an equal sharing of electrons. And you can have single, double, or triple covalent bonds. Single means one pair of electrons are shared. Double means two pairs are shared. Triple means three pairs are shared. And you can see this with the hydrogen molecule, an oxygen molecule, and a nitrogen molecule. 4 single covalent bonds can be seen in something like methane, CH4. You've got the carbon and 4 hydrogen equally bonded to it. And unequal sharing is polar covalent bonding. I was taught polar bears don't like to share. So if you can remember that, then go for it. But basically, the larger of the elements has a stronger pull on those shared electrons than the smaller. So water, for example, water is polar. Oxygen has a bigger pull on those electrons than the little hydrogen do. So oxygen is said to be slightly electronegative. Hydrogen is said to be slightly electropositive because the hydrogen is not pulling on the electrons as much as that oxygen is. So oxygen is larger, it attracts it more, so it's electronegative. So in a water molecule, the oxygen atom has a slightly negative charge and the hydrogen have a slightly positive charge, as I said. Lastly, the hydrogen bonds occurs between molecules, not between the atoms, like ionic and covalent. So water, we just talked about, a water molecule has polar covalent bonding within it. But multiple water molecules have hydrogen bonds between them. So it's polar covalent within the water, hydrogen bonds between the molecules. Hydrogen bonds are represented by dotted lines because they're very easily broken. So the water has that polar covalent bonding within it, so hydrogen bonds form between it. And hydrogen atoms in one water molecule are going to be attracted to the oxygen of another water molecule. So that's where they bind to. It's a very weak bond if you compare it to ionic and covalent bonds, but it's strong enough to hold water together, and it's also strong enough to hold DNA together. So it's not too shabby. So, name these bonds. What kind of bond is number 1? What kind of bond is number 2? What about 3? And 4. So hopefully you said nonpolar covalent for number 1, hydrogen for number 2 because that's a dotted line, and if you got confused with that arrow, that was for number 1, and the arrow up there, they're both nonpolar covalent. 3 is ionic, you have a complete transfer of electrons, and 4 is polar covalent. You see that slightly electropositive and slightly electronegative. So chemical equations and formulas basically help keep track of what's going on in a reaction. So you have 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water yields glucose plus 6 oxygen. So you have reactants, which are going into the reaction, and products coming out of the reaction. Now you can tell which is which by which way the arrow is going. So the arrow is going to always point towards products. Now some reactions are reversible, so the arrow will point in both directions. But for this one, the inputs are the reactants and the outputs are the products. Now the reactants would be carbon dioxide and water. The products would be glucose and oxygen. It can also go the other way, where the reactants are glucose and oxygen and the products are carbon dioxide and water. If the number of atoms of each element equal each other on both sides of the equation, it's a balanced equation. So if you look, we have 6 carbon. On the other side, we have 6 carbon. We've got 12 oxygen. Over on the other side, we've got 6 plus 6, 12 oxygen. Oh no, sorry, we have 18 oxygen. So you got 6 plus 12 is 18 oxygen. And then we have 12 hydrogen, 12 hydrogen. So that's a balanced equation. And that's actually the equation for photosynthesis. Sorry, what process is represented by this? Photosynthesis. So bonds give shape to molecules. So it's very important that they maintain their shape because shape and function go hand in hand. Bonds are associated with energy. So in order to break bonds, you need energy. When bonds are broken, energy is released. So it takes energy to break a bond, but when that bond is broken, it gives off energy. Water. Living things are 70 to 90% water. So the chemical properties of water are essential for life. A lot of the properties of water are due to the fact that we have hydrogen bonding between the water molecules and polar covalent bonding within the water molecule. Water has cohesiveness and adhesiveness. Cohesiveness helps it stick to other water molecules. Adhesiveness helps it stick to other surfaces. Now these are very important because that cohesiveness also forms what's called surface tension, which is important as well. But the cohesiveness, those water molecules sticking together, allows it to travel. The adhesiveness that it sticks to other surfaces also allows it to travel. So our blood, for example. Our blood is a lot of water, so it sticks together to travel through the blood vessels, but it always sticks to the sides of the blood vessels to travel as well. So it makes water an excellent transport medium for plants and animals. Plants use it to go up the trunk of the tree, basically. It'll stick to the sides of the tissue and stick together as well. And you'll learn about the phloem and xylem later. Again, the high surface tension, I've already said, is due to that cohesion. But some bugs can walk on water. You see the droplets of water, the bugs inside the droplet. And there's a lizard video up there that you can watch. The second is it warms and cools very slowly because water has a high heat of vaporization and a high heat capacity. Basically, that means it takes a long time for water to evaporate, and it also can absorb a lot of heat before it changes temperature itself. So if you've ever left a pot of water boiling on the stove and walked away and forgot about it, and you came back and there's still water in there, that's because it has a high heat of vaporization. What it does, though, is it prevents rapid changes in temperature because water is home to a lot of organisms on Earth. Water kind of acts as a buffer and prevents those temperature changes. If you've ever walked into a lake or an ocean and you start walking in and it's really warm because it's on the surface, but then you hit that one spot where it's really cold, well, that kind of shows you the water's ability to absorb temperature. It also prevents a rapid change in our body temperature. We don't want to get too cold too quickly because we would die from hypothermia. Water also dissolves other polar substances. Water is known as a universal solvent because it dissolves more things than anything else on Earth. So salt and water, for example. Salt, NaCl, will be the solute. Water, H2O, will be the solvent. Dissolving salt in water gives you salt water, which is a solution. We have two properties here, hydrophobic and hydrophilic. Phobias are fears. So if something is hydrophobic, it's a water-fearing molecule and it doesn't mix. It's non-polar. Oil, for example, water and oil do not mix. Hydrophilic is the opposite. These are polar substances. These are water-loving substances. And as you can see to the side there, the NaCl actually dissociates into ions that become surrounded by water. And that's how you get salt water. So oil is hydrophobic. It does not mix with water at all. The benefit of this is it facilitates chemical reactions very effectively. The fourth property is frozen ice, frozen water, is less dense than liquid water. This serves the ice floats. It serves as an insulation so that aquatic life does not freeze. Ice also floating ensures that all of the water on Earth isn't going to freeze during the winter. Okay, acids, bases, and pH. When water dissociates, the water molecule will go into a hydroxyl ion and a hydrogen ion. Hydroxyl ions are negative, OH minus. Hydrogen ions are positive, H plus. So acids are things that release hydrogen ions. So HCl, for example, dissociates into hydrogen and chloride. Bases release excess OH, or hydroxyl ions. NaOH, for example, dissociates into Na plus and OH negative. Salts are things like NaCl, KCl, potassium chloride, sodium chloride. Salts dissociate into something other than hydroxyl or hydrogen ions, so Na plus Cl minus. So anything that's an acid is going to release excess hydrogen. Anything that's a base is going to release excess hydroxyl. So the pH scale indicates the relative concentrations of hydrogen and hydroxyl ions in a solution. Anything less than 7 is acidic, 7 is neutral, anything more than 7 is alkaline. The more hydrogen ions you have, the lower the pH. The more hydroxyl ions you have, the higher the pH. And it goes from 0 to 14. It's logarithmic, which means that each one is 10 times stronger than the one that preceded it. So a pH of 1 has 10 times more than a pH of 2, 100 times more hydrogen ions than a pH of 3, and 1,000 times more hydrogen ions than a pH of 4. So a solution of 7 is neutral, less than 7 is acidic, greater than 7 is basic. So an acidic solution has more hydrogen ions than hydroxyl ions. A basic solution has more hydroxyl ions than hydrogen ions. So acidic, basic, or neutral, blood plasma. That is slightly basic. It's 7.35 to 7.45. Gastric fluids. It's a pH of about 1 or 2, so it's acidic. Urine. Slightly acidic usually, but that can change depending on if you're a vegetarian or a meat eater. Pure water is neutral. So most organisms have to maintain a specific pH within specific limits, like our blood, for example. Our blood is 7.35 to 7.45. So in order to help resist those changes and prevent those changes from happening, we have what are called buffers. Buffers can either take up excess hydrogen ions or take up excess hydroxyl ions. So again, human blood, 7.35 to 7.45, which has a natural buffer system. The stomach secretes too much acid and causes discomfort. So for relief, we take bicarbonate, which acts as a buffer. So if you have too much stomach acid, what do you take? An antacid, so an against an acid. We also have our lungs to exhale carbon dioxide and our kidneys to eliminate hydrogen. And you'll learn more about that if you take Anatomy 2. Ecologically speaking, acid deposition is a bad thing. Deforestation, getting rid of our trees that take up excess carbon dioxide, and burning fossil fuels increases that carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the air. Once it gets into the air and mixes with the atmospheric water, it creates acid rain or snow, and that's going to turn the lake acidic, acidify the soil, and it could lead to fish kills actually, because the fish will run out of oxygen. And it also destroys forests, it causes corrosion on buildings. It's a really bad thing. So if a pH is less than 5, acid deposition occurs. So again, plant growth, aquatic life in lakes, there's a picture of the fish kills I just talked about. What happens is algae forms, and then bacteria will come in to break down that algae, and the bacteria will use up all the oxygen. So fish can't have oxygen to breathe. Algal blooms, if you see green all over a lake or body of water, it's not pretty, that's an algal bloom. And what's going to happen is a fish kill. Forests can be completely destroyed. The picture of the before and after over there causes asthma, and as I said, corrodes buildings and vehicles. So look at the picture of the statue before and after acid rain. So it's a serious problem. So we really need to start conserving, recycling, reusing, stop driving if it's possible to lower the carbon emissions, try to start finding alternative sources of energy so we don't have to burn as much fossil fuel, and also plant more trees. Trees will take up carbon dioxide. So that is all for now. We will continue on with Chapter 3. I will see you later. Bye.